what is the workflow in terms of color grading? The general sort of understanding is to first carry out a basic color correction, or also called a base correction. So um what is the base correction? It's just correcting the image so that it looks natural, kind of like how we saw it with our own eyes when we were in that situation, or how it would look in real life. And so when you are doing the base correction of your photo, the general tab in develop mode will be your best friend. What is the second stage of color grading? Is exactly that, color grading. So once you fix your base correction, once you've adjusted your exposure, your white balance, your saturation, and just like leave everything pretty neutral, um, very natural, then step two would be getting creative. So achieving a creative look by using all of the other tools that we'll find here in develop mode. Let's start by bringing this image, by doing the base correction of this image. And obviously, we immediately know that this photo is definitely darker than how it would have probably looked to the naked eye in the moment. And so to fix the overall brightness of our photo, we just need to add some points of exposure. So we'll bring our exposure slider to the right, around there. Remember that on any edit that you apply in develop mode, if you click this little blue circle here, it will deactivate that group and allow you to see the edit that you've just done. So I'm going to take my exposure even a little bit back, around there. Now, our following slider is the highlights. In this case, I really don't need to bring any highlights down because we're working with a very, and you can see it on the histogram to the top right. You can see that most of our information, most of our color and brightness are located in between the midpoints and the shadows. And that's okay. We don't need to bring everything. We don't need to bring the luminance levels of our highlights necessarily, because the feeling of the image is a feeling of, it's the blue hour, right? So it's getting dark, and it wouldn't make sense for us to brighten this up too much. If we did, our photo will start looking certainly brighter, but not as interesting. So we'll bring it a bit more down to bring that mood into the image again. Fill light. So the fill light is sort of like raising the shadows. And so this is another good question. How do you fix your shadows, highlights, and exposures of a photo? Do you use the general tab, or do you probably go for light EQ? Light EQ, both. Okay. Definitely both tools are super useful, but you might wonder, what is the difference? And I don't know if you've noticed, but Light EQ, the applications you can do in Light EQ, are much stronger than the edits that you will do in general. So general will give you, so if for example, I raise the shadows here in Light EQ, you will see that just by moving my slider to 20, my shadows are super affected by that edit. But if I raise the fill light in general, you will see that it's a lot more smooth. This is especially obvious in the highlights. If you reduce the highlights on Light EQ, unfortunately, this photo, we will see this better in the next photo we edit that has more highlights. But just for you to keep in mind. Highlights and fill light in general are smoother. And so sometimes that's what you really want instead of doing more aggressive uh, light EQ. Okay, so we've increased the exposure of our image. I'm not going to move the contrast. I will probably add a bit of saturation. Also, do you guys know the difference between saturation and vibrance? So the difference is saturation will increase the strength of all the colors in your photo. Basically, increase the entire color of your image, increase the strength. But vibrance, what it does is that it preserves the skin tones, but only increases color around the skin. So as you can see, if I increase my vibrance to 100, my skin doesn't really change too much. The skin in the subject of this photo. And if I bring my saturation up, now my skin is super orange and very, very saturated. So maybe for this photo, I'll just increase a little bit of vibrance around my subject. Clarity. And I'm going to read straight from our user guide to avoid any confusions. Clarity. The clarity tool adds subtle definition to the details in your image. Use the clarity slider to enhance the contrast of the midtones without overpowering the shadows and highlights. Okay, so clarity, what it'll do is it'll create a bit of more of a texture feeling in our photo. And it could work in some situations, and it can be not as helpful in other situations. So I'm just going to zoom in into my subject's face, and I'm going to increase the clarity to the maximum so that you can see what it does. So this is no clarity, and this is clarity at 100%. No clarity, 100% of clarity. So you can see that the reflection, the light, the glow in her face is so much stronger when I increase clarity to 100%. For this photo, I don't think that's particularly helpful, or I don't think it adds to the sort of softness of the image, the overall softness that it has. So I might even consider lowering my clarity to make my skin tones more smooth. So I've reduced clarity, -64. Okay, so what about white balance? And this white balance would be sort of the last. It could also be the first step that you do when you're doing base correction, which remember is the first step of color grading, your base correction. But as we've already done our light adjustments only using general, now we're going to move to white balance. So in white balance, probably the easiest way to establish the correct. Oh, okay. So Dean is asking what is dehaze. So dehaze is helpful when, for example, your image, let's say your lens is a little dirty, or there's a little mark on your lens which makes your photo look blurry. This happens a lot in phones. You know, our phones, our lenses get a little, you know, you put your thumb on your lens by accident, and then you take a photo and your photo looks super um, blurry and weird. And so the dehaze, what it'll do is it'll try to reduce that effect. In this case, our photo is super sharp and we don't need to use any dehaze. So in back to white balance, the easiest way to achieve uh, like a correct white balance is to obviously make sure you have your group selected. And then when you bring the eyedropper into the image, you need to choose a natural gray pixel. Okay. And so try to look for in your image an area that you say, oh, okay, this gray, this street here, this shouldn't be this is what we would consider like a neutral gray, right? Right here on the sidewalk. So what happens if I click on it? Then all of a sudden, the temperature in my photo completely changed. And I can also choose to make the grays here neutral. And maybe that works better right there. So if I deactivate my white balance group, you will notice how my grays are more purple. And when I bring back the white balance adjustment I did, now the grays are actually gray. And you can think to yourself, well, what is better? And this is where you start taking creative decisions because this is a more natural looking image in the sense that our grays are gray, but I really like the purple tones that the photo had originally. So one thing we can do is we can accept the change we did by bringing the grays more to of a neutral state, and then maybe we can drag our tint back to the purple and see what that does to our photo. So I've dragged my tint a little bit in the middle, and now we have a solution somewhere in between. Our image is not fully purple like it was before, and we're bringing back the purple a little bit. So we're meeting somewhere in between. And that looks really good to me. So this would be the, this would be our base correction done. Remember that on the bottom, you can click Show Original and then deactivate that button to see all the edits that you've done so far. So now we're going to take it into the second stage of color grading, which would be to apply some creative stuff to it. So we're going to skip Light EQ and we're going to open Color EQ. And just to showcase you a little bit of what you can do with Color EQ, I'm going to bring back my temperature to make it a little bit more pink. And then you can see that our face has a little bit of pink itself. So what you can do in Color EQ is that you can tone down certain colors or increase other colors to change the overall aspect of your image. And so, for example, you can, for example, say, oh, this photo is really cool, but these reds here, they're a little bit too intense. So all you have to do is bring your red slider, bring it back, and reduce its contrast. And then you might say to yourself, oh, but when I bring the red down, I'm also bringing down the red in my overall image and in my face, and that definitely does not look good. So something you can do is take it to the next step and open up the color wheel. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to reduce the saturation of these bokeh lights right in the background without affecting our subject. And I'm going to open my color wheel and click on the red dot right here. Now, I've selected that, but to make sure that I'm only selecting those lights, I'm going to drag my wheel to the right. So when you drag the center of your wheel to the right, you're going to start realizing, you're going to start noticing that only the strong reds are being selected with some yellow, and I'm able to isolate the red color with my color wheel so that when I either increase or decrease saturation, I'm only affecting those red colors and not my skin. So I reduce saturation just a little bit. And remember, whenever you start doing all these kinds of edits, it's okay for you to go back and change some things because obviously all edits are affecting each other. Now, how can I make my subject stand out a little bit more? You can open the masking group and select the radial gradient. So with the radial gradient, I can mask my photo and apply certain edits only to a specific area of that photo. And so what I probably want to do is I want to make her face maybe a little bit brighter to make her stand out even more compared to our background. So just bring your radial gradient and adjust it roughly to the shape of her face. Next, we need to invert our radial gradient because everything that's in red will be affected by our edits. To invert the mask, head down to this little menu down here and click on Invert. Now you'll see that the red is only being applied to her face. I'm going to increase feathering to make my edit even more smooth. Then I'll hide the mask and I'll increase the exposure just a little bit to see what happens. So let's look at the before and after I did that edit. That's before and that's after. So just a very, very small adjustment can make our subject pop from the photo a lot better. I'm actually going to bring my exposure down a touch to bring that moodiness back to it and maybe increase the exposure of my subject's face a little bit more. And so that's a very basic edit that we've done using develop mode with some of the tools that can definitely help you color grade creatively in your photo. But let's do a more intensive edit this time. I'm going to click Done. ACDSee will apply those changes, but it won't, because it's non-destructive, it won't save on the image itself. I can always go back by opening this photo back in develop mode and undo all of the changes that I've made. Okay. So now we have a very blue photo, right? Let's do the same steps we did before. Instead of going straight to general and changing my exposure, my light adjustments, the blue is really getting in the way. So I would say this is the first thing we need to change in this image to start color grading it. So let's open up our white balance group and bring our eyedropper to some area that we would consider to be a neutral gray pixel. So it could be the white too, obviously. And it seems to me that right here, close to this window, I think it is, would be a good point to place our eyedropper. So let's see what happens when I do that. All of a sudden, the white balance of our photo is corrected and our image starts looking natural. And you can realize how intense those blues were, totally getting in the way of a good photo. So now that we've corrected the white balance, let's go ahead and continue the basic correction of this image. I'll reduce the exposure a little bit, maybe even the highlights a little bit. And I'm going to add a little bit of contrast. I'll add contrast and also vibrance. When I increase the vibrance, I immediately think, those greens start looking not as good. But we will change those greens later in my photo. And you'll see how that will come together in the end. Clarity, not really helpful in this case, so I'll just leave it in 0. Okay, so I've changed. Maybe I'll bring back the highlights. So I've changed the white balance and the overall light of my photo, and it's looking a lot better. Oh, Joe asks, how did you get to the dropper? So all you have to do is click on white balance, either open the group or click on the group again. And then when you drag your mouse over to the photo, the eyedropper will appear. So Della is asking, will contrast sharpen any blurry photo? So no, contrast does not add sharpness to your photo. It just creates a bigger difference between your highlights and shadows. You should definitely watch our workshop we have on noise reduction because that covers sharpening too. Okay, so I think I went a little bit too much with my vibrance. I'm going to bring it down a little bit more. And I'm going to hide my groups just so that we can look at everything a bit more organized. And as I was saying, not so pleased with the tone of this green here. So I'm just going to reduce them a little bit. This will absolutely change the feeling of this photo, but that's okay because my original photo is this strange blue sort of morning look, and I'm going to transform it into an evening sunset feeling. So what if I take that, bring down the saturation of greens? That's a lot more pleasing to me. So that's before and then after. My greens have been toned down in their saturation, and that makes me focus a lot more in my subject's face instead of being distracted by the intensity of the green. Okay, let's keep going. Color wheel. Not going to do anything with the color wheel right now, but I'm definitely going to start playing around with the tone wheels. How many of you use the tone wheels? Type 0 if you never use them, type 1 if you sometimes use them, type 2 if you always use them. I have a feeling not a lot of people are going to use tone wheels. Yeah. Okay, so tone wheels could look pretty daunting in the beginning, but honestly, it's not that tricky. So what the tone wheels are doing is we can add color, we can add a specific color to either the shadows, the midtones, or the highlights of our photo. So as I was saying, I want to make this photo look more like a sunset. So probably a good way to go is to add an overall red tone or orange tone to my image. So I'm going to start by dragging my shadow tone wheel to the reds. And immediately our image starts looking a lot more sepia. So if I go very extreme, you'll notice how my shadows are being tinted by the color I'm choosing in the tone wheel. So I can make my shadows teal, I can make my shadows blue, but I like this sort of sepia thing we got going on. You can also increase the saturation. So the left sort of slider you see here is the saturation slider. This is just another way to use the tone wheel. Instead of moving it left to right yourself, you can choose to increase the saturation of the color you're adding to the shadows by moving the left slider. My right slider changes the brightness of the color that I'm adding. So if I increase the brightness of my red tones in the shadows, my reds will be brighter or they will be darker if I reduce the brightness. So I'm going to reset this group to its default settings. And Bill is asking, can you use tone wheels to compensate for sensor color casts? Totally. You can, like if your photo, like you can change the midtones, for example. And we can bring both our midtones and our shadows a little bit to the reds. Maybe our highlights could be just slightly yellow. And again, don't make heavy edits. Just do very slight stuff. Like if I deactivate my group, you can see the difference. This is how it looked before. So it's still preserving sort of that blue cast that our photo had. But when I add my tone wheel back, I can definitely see more of a sunset feeling. So by looking at my photo, I'm realizing it's a little bit bright. And maybe I want to bring my shadows a little bit more down. So I'm just going to open Light EQ and bring my shadows and midtones just ever so slightly to the left. I did lose some detail, so maybe I'll bring back my shadows and maybe just change my exposure slightly. Okay. Yep. So we're going to look at how our image looked before. So that's how our photo looked before and how it looks after. Big difference. So obviously, when I open color EQ and when you open either the color wheel or the tone wheels, you're stepping into the second part of color grading, which is a creative look. And what we're trying to achieve in our second step of color grading is to create a more sunsetty sepia feel to our photo. So let's keep going. We're going to skip the tone curves for now. Let's open up soft focus. So soft focus, what it does, it softens your photo. And you can use it. It's sort of like the opposite of dehaze, and you can use it to create a more of a dreamy look in your image. So maybe I'll just apply a little bit. In effects, you have photo effects, color overlays, grading maps, but we're not going to use these. We're going to instead use color LUTs in just a second. But what I definitely want to do is, because our photo is sort of acquiring much more of a film look, compared to our first edit, I'm going to add some grain. So down in effects, you will see add grain. And this is super cool when you want to make your photo feel more film-like. You can change the smoothness of the grain. You can change the grain size, but we're going to keep it really close to our original settings. So that's before and after. It's hard to see the difference in grain with how we are sharing our screen through Zoom right now, obviously. But if you try it on your computer, you'll notice a difference. Okay, so do you guys know the difference between a photo effect, like the ones I'm applying right now, versus a color LUT? Okay, so I'm just going to deactivate my LUT. Okay, so this is good. The photo effect is like an Instagram filter. It will just apply, think of it as a sort of this overlay of tone that is added to your image. Okay. It can be really interesting. Is that what you're trying to do? But when we're color grading, I don't recommend using the photo effect. I recommend using the color LUT. And the color LUT, yes, thanks, Tom. So the LUT, what will it will actually do is it'll change the actual, it's basically like changing the original data, yeah, original data of your photo, basically changing the color science of your photo. Let's look up just a definition to make this even more clear. So a color LUT applies a predetermined sets of mathematical formulas to your photo's existing colors to change those colors and achieve a desired result. So thanks, Dan. LUT stands for lookup table. It's kind of a funny name, but what the color LUT is doing is it's not adding a filter or an overlay on your photo. It's actually changing the color of the pixel inside your photo. You can start with, Mel is asking, why wouldn't you start with LUT when working on the photo? And that is totally a valid approach. You can just open a photo, apply a LUT, but I don't know. I think it's better for you to take things step by step, and a color LUT can be the final um, touch that you can give your image to really enhance the mood of it. Um, but yeah, you can start with a LUT, and that's absolutely a workflow you can do. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the LUTs. We have beige, dusk, elegance, film. The film adds this sort of orange and teal tone to your photo, and I'm going to go with beige. But I'm going to, because I mean, this is too much. Our photo went from looking natural to looking very, very um, um, stylized. And so what I recommend is whenever you add a LUT is to open this with this little arrow here, the opacity slider of that LUT, and bring it down. So I'm not using the LUT to change my photo dramatically. I'm just using it to add just a touch of color. And you can see it has a difference. It becomes a little darker, a little less contrasty, a little smoother. So to finish off my photo, I'm going to skip split tone for now, and I'm going to open post crop vignette. Do you guys vignette your photos? Type 0 if you apply vignette. type 0 if you don't apply any vignette, type 1 if you do. Great. So applying a vignette is really helpful when you want, yeah, it totally depends on the image. When you have a subject in the middle of your photo, adding a vignette definitely helps to bring attention back to um your subject. And so when you open the post crop vignette, if you bring your slider to the right, it will add a white vignette around your image. And if you bring it to the left, it'll add a darker vignette. I'm not going to go so extreme like this. I'm just adding a little bit right there. It helps to encapsulate your subject. Okay, so let's take a look at our original. That's how our photo looked in the beginning, and that's how it looks now. So it's a big change. It's a big change in color. It's a big change in mood. Um, and we've been able to color grade this image to look more stylized, to look better. Um, and now I'm just thinking maybe I can also add a radial gradient around her face. Maybe making her face pop a little bit more. I'll invert my radial gradient mask. Maybe I'll move it slightly to the left. And I'm going to increase the exposure just a touch. Just there. There we go. So there we have it. Can you do her eyes? That's a really good point, or a really good idea. I can make her eyes um brighter or more contrasty. So let's do that. I'm going to add, instead of a radial gradient, it's a lot easier to select the eyes with a brush. So I'm going to open the brush and I'm going to brush over my subject's eyes. Remember to show mask so that you can see what you're doing. And now I have both of her eyes selected. Yeah, Advent, you can copy right here. Copy the currently selected mask. You can copy it many times and, just do all whatever you want there. Okay, so I'm going to hide my mask and I'm going to increase the brightness in her eyes just a little bit, like that. And I'm also going to increase the saturation. Okay, so I'm going to bring my image back to normal. Maybe I'll still reduce the eye exposure a little bit because it starts looking a bit unnatural. But there we go. So that's our original photo and our photo after. I'm going to click done. And now maybe we do our last photo. Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to have time for our snowy image here, but I wanted to open this one because I want to use the tone curves on this one, which was our previous uh, workshop. Apparently was super helpful. So, okay, let's do the steps again of color grading. I think by looking at this photo, I'm thinking to myself, I want to make this a lot more mysterious looking, um, less bright, a bit more, yeah, mysterious, darker. So I'll start off by reducing my exposure a little bit, maybe reducing my saturation too, increasing some increasing a little bit of contrast. And the clarity and the haze, I'm just going to leave them as is. So already our photo looks a bit darker, a bit more mysterious. Let's see what we can do with our white balance. Instead of clicking on my image to select the white balance, because like you can look here at the bottom, these are the gray tones, natural gray pixels that can help me find the white balance point I want. And it worked really well there. So my photo before had these blue tones overcast on it, and now it looks more warm. I'm going to open Light EQ, see if I can do more adjustments this way. Maybe I can bring down my shadows even more. I'll also bring down my highlights to reduce a bit of that striking contrast, but maybe increase a bit of my midtones. So that's before Light EQ and after Light EQ. You can see that my photo looks a lot more contrasty. But this is good because what I'm going to do next is I'm going to open the tone curves. So type 0 if you didn't watch the tone curve workshop, type 1 if you did watch the tone curve workshop. Great. Well, if you haven't, I totally recommend going and checking it out because I think it opens up a lot of possibilities. You can do so much with the tone curve, and it's just only one tool. So super helpful if you guys want to check that out. Just a quick overview of the tone curve. Here we have a little histogram, and our line here, which is the curve, my bottom left are the blacks, and my top right are the whites. So everything in between is everything in between. Here is the exact point of my midtones, my shadows, and my highlights. So usually you will find that an S curve will add contrast to your image by reducing the shadows in their brightness and increasing the brightness in your highlights. And that definitely does exactly that. So our photo is a lot contrasty, and very dark, probably a little too dark. But what I want to do with the tone curve is I want to soften my image. And in what way can I soften my image is by increasing my black point more to a gray. So what I've done is I've selected the bottom left point of my curve and I'm making my blacks brighter so they're closer to gray. And this will make your photos instantly look more film-like. And it'll fix that sort of problem I had because this is before the tone curve. So it's super contrasty. It's not really pleasing to the eye. And then after applying my tone curve, I can see how I've softened the blacks in my photo. And so maybe I can definitely bring, and you can just play around by adding points. Let's try that again. If I select different points in my curve, I am basically blocking this part of my line and it won't affect those. So if I raise my shadows here, I'm only affecting this part of my histogram. So I'll bring up my blacks to make my image softer, and maybe I'll roll down the whites a little bit more too. That's before, and this is after. And obviously, we can end this by adding a color LUT. So let's take a look at what the color LUTs do to our image. This is pretty cool, elegance. I'm going to tone it down by bringing the opacity to 50%. And now my photo looks smoother, a bit more mysterious. It looks softer in the contrast. That's really important. So take a look at the original photo. There's a lot of light, there's a lot of contrast, but definitely lacks in feeling. And so after I've applied my edits, now my photo looks a lot more moody, which is totally what I wanted to achieve. Maybe I'll add a little bit of vignette. And to do a final touch. So a photo that looks, it's a cool photo, but it's not so pleasing, becomes a more interesting photo. So there you have it. We've taken 3 photos and we've applied 2 steps. The first step in color grading would be to achieve an overall natural view of your photo by changing exposure, by changing white balance, saturation, and then we take it a step further by working with tone curves, by working with tone wheels, color LUTs, and applying a more creative edit to our photo. We can take this even further by bringing our shadows. We could make our shadows now this sort of purple look or blue tone. It all depends what you're trying to achieve. So maybe if I bring my shadows closer to the teal or blue and my highlights make them a bit more orange, I can acquire more of a film look. So that's before and after. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Marv, Francois. Thank everyone. If you guys have any questions, please, now is the moment. Really glad that it was helpful. Yeah, it's so fun to just grab a photo. Again, I'm going to share the link to the website that has um, free raw photos. And if you have time, you should absolutely download a bunch of them and play around, see what you can come up with, and obviously share your edits on ACDSee Connect. David asks, can you select the vignette colors? Not currently, I'm afraid. The LUTs are intimidating every time or usually because they apply a strong, they change your colors way too intensely. So my recommendation is to definitely use um, color LUTs, but just bring their opacity down. I guess I can add a little grain to this photo in my effects panel here to make it more film-like. So that's awesome. Look at that. Before, after. A lot more character in my image. So Dean is asking, can you use history to create a template for other photos? What you can do is that you can say, like, all of the edits that I've done here, you can save them as a preset by choosing the, um, sorry, by choosing this one up here. This wheel. Oh, I just resetted everything to default. by using this one here, develop settings. So if you save your preset, it'll open up this window, says select the settings you want to save into this preset, and you can just click select all, put a name on it, and I can just say like, I don't know, film look. And then just click OK. And then when you open another image, you just go up here again, go to your presets, and look for the one that you saved. There's a bunch of presets that ACDSee comes with, so you can also play around with those, load those up, see how they look. So I'm just going to click done. And that's a wrap for today. Thank you so much, guys.